Well, thank you for joining me for this painting today. Now I'm working on a little painting of the Virgin River as it flows near Zion National Park. And I love the pastoral feeling of this that I have from a sketching opportunity out there. So what I'm doing now is I'm making reference then to the reference photo that I shot, as well as my memories of being there, because I never draw or sketch any place that I haven't been. But right now what I'm doing is I'm just putting a few little light pencil outlines on my watercolor paper, which is Arches 140 pound. And as I sketch those outlines, I'm really referencing this photo here in terms of the shape of the river. That's what's interesting to me, how it goes back and leads into the distance. And then the light, which is coming from our left, is kind of coming down and showing on the left-hand side of the trees as it comes forward into the foreground. So I've got the paper taped down to incredible artboard, and now I'm going to wet. I'm just going to reach up here with this, this is a 1-inch Aquarelle brush, and I'm going to soak the top part just where the sky is. Now I'm outlining this edge and being careful to just stay up there. The rest of the paper is dry. But where I'm going to put the sky wash in, I want that to be soaked, and I want the water to soak into the fabric of the paper so that it will draw the pigment in when we apply it to it. So I'm going to use 3 colors here. The first is yellow ochre, which I'll mix out here in my Eldajon palette, and I'll drop a little bit of this yellow ochre right down here along the skyline, and I will bring that across. That's going to give us just a kind of a light tone that comes through. And then as that begins to settle into it, I check the edge, and if there's a heavy bead there, I'll just turn it upside down and allow that pigment and water to flow back towards the top of the sky area. As that begins to settle into the paper now, I can come over to my palette and I can work a little bit on the additional colors. So what I will do next, once that settles in, is I will bring those other colors into it. Right now I'm just going to clean the edges off, so it's just kind of nice and tidy, and so the water doesn't run back into my wash. Because each time you apply your brush to it, you're applying a little more water. So you've got to keep that in mind. Now I see a bead forming here, and you can see that. Now I'm going to let that run back in a little bit and settle into the paper. See how shiny that is? That's because it's got way too much water on the top. So we want that to sink in. Some people use a dryer. I just give it a little time to wait. So I'm going to use a blue here as we form this sky. And this is a Thalo Blue, which really has a lot of green in it. And so I'll dull that back a little bit with Ultramarine, which is a staple blue in my paintings. And I'll take that little mixture here, and I'm going to run a stroke of blue back and forth, part way down to that wash. I'll pick up some more pigment and do it again. Since it's just such a tiny area, I don't want to build in clouds and all that. But as you look at the sky, it's darker blue up towards the top, or the zenith, and always gets warmer as it approaches the horizon. So even in a little small area like this, if it's just even a couple of inches at the top here, I'm going to still try to give that feeling of going from blue down to green and dropping off into the yellow and warms of the horizon. I'm exaggerating that, but it does a lot to give us the sense of aerial perspective or distance in our paintings. So now that I've got that in place, once again, that's a very wet area. So the paper is tipped on my board towards me, so it's flowing down into the lower areas there. I'm adding some reds now, and I'm moving into the foreground and allowing that sky to dry. So while it's drying, I'm going to start laying in a lot of my light and middle values across the foreground area. And just come along here and bring some of those in. I'm going to kind of stay away from the water because I want that to just be kind of a nice blue when I get into it. And if you look up at the finished painting here, you can see how that blue is going to really pull out against the darks that are around it. Will be perceived by the eye as just a light area. So what I'm doing now is I'm laying in the lightest areas of the darks. Okay, these will be the areas where the sunlight's hitting. They'll be on the sunny side of the trees, and what I'm going to do is just try to reach into different colors, different yellows, and approach that in very loose, very abstract terms. A lot of people, when they see my paintings at this stage, they say, wow, you're kind of loose on this. Your finished paintings look very detailed and tight. Well, that's because I don't have to be tight at this stage. I just need to wash a bunch of color in there and get rid of the whites that are there. You hear a lot of times preserve the whites. Well, it's not so much that as preserve the lights. So I'm putting this tone in over my lightest areas, and as I build the darks over the top of that, I don't have to worry about the edges. So here I'm just taking about a number 10 brush, a round Princeton, and just bringing in a variety of colors where I need it. And as I look up at the reference photo, I can get some ideas for where this is going to be. But I've studied it out enough, and I probably don't even need a reference photo nearby to carry it through from here. I know exactly where I'm going. So all of this approach right in here is to lay the light and the middle values down, and then I'll come back after that's dry in just a little bit, and then I'll darken those areas up. So I'll continue to just work on this and get some of this foreground shrubbery and the trees all laid in. So I'll reach in now and grab a little bit of kind of a gray that I'll get from mixing Quinacridone coral, and also the Ultramarine Blue, which is a cooler blue. And I'm going to lay in some of these shadows that are going across the foreground area where the sand will be. Now, they're going to be darker than this when we finish up. These will be the lightest areas of that. So I'm going to go ahead and get those in there now. And when that's completely dry, you'll see me come back and make all this area quite a bit darker. But in transparent watercolor, we work in stages from light to dark. And we do have to preserve our lights because we don't, we can't get that back after we cover it up with the dark. It's very difficult to do that. So now, with these other colors drying down, I'm going to lay in that very, very light blue of the water as it moves up and shapes and approaches the foreground here. So very quickly, in the first few minutes, really, at least in the first half an hour, we're going to have this whole thing all laid in. And the second stage of it then, which may take even longer than that, will be to bring in some of the darks and the details and do the negative painting that makes it all look real. So I'm darkening this up just a little bit in the front here, trying to get things not so much in their final value at this point. You would do that in oils. If we were painting in oils, we'd try to achieve those values right off the bat and then adjust the color. But because we're working in watercolor, I like to get the color in there in a light and middle value, and then from there bring it up and bring it to a state at the end where I can really adjust it with my lightest lights and less contrast off in the distance and more contrast and darker darks up in the foreground. So right now I'm basically getting in where the shadows come across on the sand area and on the beach along the edges of this river. So you see that all the whites are kind of disappearing. I've still got lights, but all the whites are disappearing as I begin to apply the darks. And this will go in stages. Okay, right here, I'm getting the really dark where the shadow's going to come across. And of course, that shadow's got to connect and move from one side of the river to the other. Part of the law of using shadows as they cross water, you really don't see a cast shadow across the top of the water. Where you'll see the shadow come across the water is really the shadow falling on the sand underneath the water. So you're only going to see that cast shadow cross there dark enough to notice if it's about an inch deep or a couple of inches deep, not very deep at all, or if the water is so murky and so dark that it's almost sand in and of itself. That's when you're going to see the shadows cross the water. Otherwise, you could kind of ignore water as you're placing your shadows. Obviously here it's very shallow water and we're seeing the shadows as they come across. So we'll darken up the water after we get these shadows drawn in across the sand area. As we glance up to the finished painting example here, we can see how this is starting to form in this foreground area here. Working upward in stages from one stage to the next. So here once again I'm making a little bit of a darker, kind of a it's kind of a purple, but it's got some blues back in there because we have some light areas, light passages at the top of these cliffs, what we call stratas or bands that come across and define these layers that have been formed through a lot of years of time. And we see those that are very typical of the cliffs around here. This distant cliff back here, I'll go ahead and touch in a much lighter blue and not so much red in it, but I'll just really start with a very, very light tone back here because that is so far off in the distance. Everything off in the distance gets lighter in value, less intense in terms of chroma or intensity, and less detail. So we'll simplify this shape back there. We'll keep it in the blue range, but after this dries down a little, we might touch a little bit of red or indicate some of just a little bit of the shadows back in there. But anything back in the distance like this, we need to keep very, very simple. So notice again as we look up at the finished painting up here, notice how that blue forms the edge of that yellow tree right there, which is kind of a significant part of the painting. So I'm very careful as I come around the edge of that. I'm painting the dark back there, but I'm leaving the lights where the tree will be. Same thing as I work over here now. I'm going to bring more of a red because these cliffs are closer to us, but I'm really leaving a light edge right as it starts because I want to keep those separated. Now this I have to pay a little more attention to on this cliff because it's closer to us. So we're going to see shadows and we're going to see a little more detail, and we're certainly going to see the strata of these cliffs as it comes up towards us. But still we're keeping those values very, very light because it's so far off in the distance. we will reserve our darkest darks for the shadow area up in the foreground. Now I'm going to be a little careful right in here to not to cover up where the strata marks are, or the lighter part at the top of those cliffs. So I'll just kind of get some of these shadows right in here and form that edge. And as I approach these trees, I'm going to be very cautious because they're much, much closer to us. So the edge that they form, I'm doing this negative painting where I'm painting the dark, but it's going to reveal the light of the trees right here up against the edge. So I need to have a little bit of detail in there and take care of this. Okay, now finish off the shape of this cliff. Now you can notice a little better how I'm just leaving that light. It's kind of blue or grayish that shows the band that comes across there. Okay, so as we're working on this and moving forward, we're going to identify and delineate just a few of these little shapes. I'm using this very light kind of a maroon color that's on this distant cliff as I'm coming across and making this work. I'm actually painting the darks, but the purpose is to define or reveal the edges of these trees. Now, right now, that cliff is darker than the trees. We're going to darken the trees up, and that'll require us to darken the distant cliffs up again a little bit more. But for now, let's just shape these trees as they come up around here, and then we'll come back to that later. We'll just kind of poke around a little bit, redefine some of these middle ground shapes, and poke along here a little bit. What we've got down right now is our lightest values, of course, and some of the more middle range values that you see along the edge, especially when I'm working right here and right down in here. I'm just grabbing some clear water now and softening these edges a little bit. But those darks that are right in there, they're pretty close, you know. And so now I've got lightest lights and some middle values. And what I want to do is now let's move the our reference material, which is this photograph. I've printed it out on an inkjet printer, just a little print, and then tape that to our painting. And now that'll give us a chance to look and see where we are. Is the water dark enough yet? Is this distant cliff dark enough yet? Is the blue of that mountain in the distance dark? How about my lights and my darks in these trees? Well, we're getting there, but we're not even close. We've got to build up that value so that our darker darks are in the foreground and our lightest lights are off in the distance. Well, what my pattern is here is to go from light to dark kind of gradually. So I'll mix in a little bit of blue here as we're going to come in, and I'm going to maybe define the edge of this this water along the left bank. And right now the blue is just kind of a placeholder. I'm going to darken that up in a minute because look how dark that whole left side is. And all I'm doing right now is I'm just darkening up the water. Well, by the time I get those trees as dark as they need to be, this water that I'm putting in here that looks darker than them right now will not be. So I'm going to darken up this foreground in the water using a little ultramarine blue and a touch of quinacridone coral. That's going to make kind of a violet. And I'm going to get this in the water up here into about the right value range that I want and start to pull that across right here and pull that out into the water. Now this is actually a cast shadow area. most of the time with water, we don't see a cast shadow on the surface of the water. If we see a strong shadow, it's because the river is very, very shallow, or the lake, or whatever it might be. And we see the shadow going across the sand underneath the water. And that's really the case here. This water's only just a few inches deep, not very much at all. So we're seeing a few of these cast shadows that are falling across there. The blue of the water, it's not because the water's blue, it's because we see a reflection of the sky above it. And the reflection of the sky, which is blue, is what makes the water appear blue. But now, because of the shadow that's underneath the water on the sand below it, we see these darks coming across. And it looks very natural and very real when we pay attention to the shadows in nature. So these cast shadows that come across here are very important. So what I'm doing now is I'm moving into the middle ground, or the middle value areas, and establishing them. So now I've got a range of things to gauge the other values off of. So I'll continue to work up here in the middle and work my way forward to the foreground. Well, even the sand, this slight area in the front that's here on our right, even that's going to be much darker. So I'll pick up some of this Quinacridone coral and a touch more of the blue, and you make kind of a little more of a violet color. If you look up at the reference photo up above there, you see that it's kind of a violet, and that's pretty natural. And this will be about as dark as the water will go, and we'll make darker darks around that. But let's get this water in the foreground and some of this sand in the foreground. Work on that for a minute here, and kind of bring this up into the right value range. Notice I'm careful as I bring this dark up around that foreground bush. That's going to have a lot of detail in it because it's right up close to us. And so I'm doing a little negative painting there to create some hard edges. And I was just kind of careful there, but now I'm going to move over here with this blue to this area. And right now it looks pretty dark, but as we move further into the painting, it's going to feel very, very comfortable. Okay, so we see the blue that's kind of light in the background. As it comes forward, it moves purple. I'm bringing these shadows back in the distance, but I don't want them to be as dark as the shadows in the foreground. So I'm keeping those fairly light, letting my brush be thinned, not too much pigment on it, and a little more water. So that looks pretty comfortable as we compare those two together. And this sand right here in the foreground is going to need some business going on in it, and we're going to kind of need to darken that, especially right up at the point. So I'm going to reach into my Quinacridone Sienna and a little bit of the Quinacridone Burnt Orange as well, and touch a little bit of this magenta into that. So I'm getting it quite dark, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to do that sand right up here in this little point that comes up in the water. This, of course, is where there is some shadow that runs across there to create the sandbank that runs back into there. And I'll just continue now to work on this as we move forward. And right now, I just want to just identify these darks in the foreground, a little bit about the edges, and just kind of bring it forward as I work my way up. Now there's little pebbles and rocks back up in here, and so I won't do too much detail at this point, but I'll just continue to work on this and shape the sandbank, and also darken up the water as the shadows come across in the foreground too. Right back here, this is just a little bit of blue, ultramarine blue, very pale mix that I'm putting down here in the water here to shape some of the sand that's coming down here. And we'll just continue to move forward with this. Let's see, so right along in here, I'll just define this edge, and you can see as I put these darks into it, it really starts to pull those forward, those strong darks. And we'll eventually have all the trees darker and the foreground along the sand as well. We've got to build it up gradually as we go. So let's just darken some of this where the shadow crosses over and changes the look of the sand and the water up in here. Let's just kind of, I'm going to keep it kind of a pale gray. You saw me use a little touch of red right here and then put it in with the blue and identify this part of the sand and water in the foreground. It's not quite as dark as what that middle is where the shadow comes across, but we're starting to give some dimension to this foreground. Now pick up the Ultramarine Blue right here and mix out a little well of that. Because it's I'm going to need something at least that dark up in here, so I need to evaluate where that's gonna be along this edge. And just use that blue, just a straight blue, because we're working in the water here, darkening up those shadows in the water, so it's staying more blue than it is red. And just kind of continue where that shadow reaches out across the sandbank. And I'll have to darken up the water as well up in that area. But once we see these shadows start to crawl across here, it really starts to give a feeling of the depth and distance, and it starts to look much more real. The shadows do so much more for us than we think they do. Especially in novice artists, we tend to leave shadows out. Well, the shadows are the very thing that we see in nature that help us to identify shapes and edges and that look like the world that we live in, because we live in a world of shadow and light. Now I'm going to pick up a little bit of this orange here, cadmium orange, and cadmium red light, mix that with some of this quinacridone coral, so that I have a red, kind of a reddish, especially as we come forward on this sandbank. I want to get some of that red tone into it that's going to give it life. And the warmer colors then are going to give us the feeling that things are closer to us. And of course, as we go back, based on the law of atmospheric perspective or aerial perspective, things get duller and not quite so intense in terms of chroma as the colors go back in space. But look at the warmth that's created by these reds, and we just feel that that's up in the foreground. We feel that red sand and the warmth that's coming across there. A little bit up in this area, work that way down. Again, those reds help it to feel like we're working forward, and we won't need to. These are the lighter parts, so we won't need anything darker than that. We'll bring some darks in, but this will be our lighter areas. And I'm just evaluating between the painting right here that I'm working on and the reference photo up above. I'm kind of looking carefully at those and planning my attack as I move forward here. So let's pick up a few more reds, and let's start on this area on the left bank. And again, that's going to be quite dark, so I'm going to get the reds in here, but I want to reserve the right to come back into that and make it even darker than it is. Right along that rim right here, I'm going to really, I'm adding blue to that red while it's still wet so it blends, but I'm really delineating the bottom part of that riverbank right there as it comes along. Can't resist the urge to just touch it here and there. But knowing that these trees are going to be so much darker than they are right now. Right now that dark looks pretty dark, but it won't be as we continue to pursue this. Okay, now I'm getting the sandy areas in, and that's why I'm using the red, because when I get up in the trees, they'll be a darker gold and green. But down here in this part, I get that in. And as I look at it now, I'm saying, well, eventually I'm going to need to come in and darken up that the blue water in the foreground and make that much stronger and a little darker as well. So I'm going to work my way up along in here and just kind of get the sandy areas in. Now I'm going to reach into my ultramarine blue and darken that up again right down in this area here. I've got to be careful as I work in this area because I don't want to obliterate that warm yellow in the foreground, which is going to be a bush that sticks right up into it. So I have to do a little negative painting right here. And define a few of these edges as I work my darks up to it. We always paint the darks, but the darks end up revealing the light shapes. So now I want just a little tight edge here and there. Don't have to worry too much about the body of this bush, but I do need to preserve these edges. So I'm carefully working my way through that and deciding, well, where do I want it to be? Then I can come back up in here now and to continue on with I'm just using the blue, but over the yellow it makes it kind of a green. I try to reach into different colors as I come back into my palette. I'm using a Quinacridone gold right now with that ultramarine blue to make kind of a dark gold or a burnt gold as I come back up in here. That gives me the dark that I need for the shadow side, but still keeps it warm. So now you can see once I start to darken in this bank of trees right up in right here in this area, and you can see how it feels like now that pulls these forward. The darks always tend to do that, but I'm going a little bit darker here on this back side and trying to bring it. I picked up a little bit of phthalo here, which is very strong, and it's very dark too. So I'm using that for my darks in that area that's already wet, touching a little bit of this New Gamboge, which is a very bright yellow, and letting that mix with these darks as well to create kind of an olive drab that's very warm. And I've got to get all this bank on this side, all these shrubs and that into this darker value range. And when I get those darks in, it's going to really make that water pop. But I'd have to do it in sequence. I have to start with the light lights and continue to work and build up to the middle values and then evaluate where I'm at and move into the darker ranges. Because even that distant cliff back there and the distant cliff on the right, they're going to be darker than that ultimately. But we'll just work our way there gradually and build this area up. A little touch of orange in with this yellow that I have, a little bit of the Quinacridone sienna, and warm that up back in the darker shadows and see the life that that gives it. Instead of being a dull green, now we have warmth that comes out of that shadow side. Let that blend down in here to the sand. And that makes it very, very comfortable. Again, we'll come in with some more darks, but for now, this is bringing it into the right value range that we need. A little bit of some more of this, well, let's touch a little bit of this blue down here and mix that with this little puddle of Quinacridone gold basically that we have. And I'm making kind of a gray. It's a very thin mix, as you can see. And I want it to be grayer so it appears that it's further back in the distance as I work on these very, very distant trees. So I don't want something really strong, and I don't want it to be too dark either. Now it's starting to shape up nicely. And when I get the trees in on the right side, or the right bank there, and darken up the shadow parts of those, then the whole thing was going to feel more natural. And it feels natural because we get the values right. It's not so much about color as it is the values. The values are 80% of the success of a painting, and color's 20%. Composition, of course, is important too, but if you get the values right, it really doesn't matter what colors you use. You can use almost any palette. That's why there's such, if you look at any of the art books and everything, you see these variety of palettes and color combinations and triads and different things like that that you can try to use. And some work better than others, but if you get the values right, they'll all work. It's just a matter of studying the values in nature and working them. Now, I'm being a little bit cautious right here around the edge of this tree because, once again, as I mentioned before, I'm trying to preserve the highlights where the sun hits on that side of it. And I'm just evaluating, looking back and forth to see how dark I need to go. Not too dark, because I want them to stay in the background. And but I still need to keep kind of a hard edge back there. So I'm studying those values and I'm saying, well, how dark do I need to go? We can always go darker, but we can't go lighter. So that's why we build up from light to dark and kind of careful, a little bit cautious about where we put it. Okay, some sap green mixed with quinacridone sienna here. This is a stronger green because we're moving forward. It's also a darker dark. And now we'll work in some of the shadow areas on these trees on the right. Since the paper's dry in this area, I get a hard edge with my brush. And so I can kind of identify some of the more, few of the detail areas, all the detail that there would be in the middle ground. I can get it. So I'll grab a little bit of clear water right here, touch these edges, and that softens it. We don't want just hard edges everywhere. We want a nice dark, and then we want that to roll from there out into the other part of the tree foliage here. So I'm going to darken up this side, grab my darks, come up underneath here where you see the darks and where there's going to be shadow, and I'll work my way up around. The whole time leaving that left side of those trees very light, because that's what's going to separate them from the background. But I still got to get these darks back up there in the shadow. Yes, I think that's, just soften that edge a little bit. That looks good. I'm just kind of studying out in my mind. I know that the paint's going to dry lighter than it is, and I'm just trying to see if that's too dark right where the river turns, or if that foliage there on the tree right here needs to be darker yet. So it's constant evaluation as you paint and as you work on it. It's just studying the value relationships and being in control of the edges where light meets dark. That's what gives us our forms. And then the gradual turning of light to dark is what gives us the mass or the feeling of volume in the shapes that we create. So I'll just fuss with this edge here a little bit, and then I'm saying, I don't know, maybe it needs to be darker over there. And of course it does. So I'll start to bring that forward now to match. Right in here, down along this bank where the sand meets the water. And when we start to get these final darks in, we start to see the power, the punch that comes from the dark and the light. And we get to see how that river just kind of pops out of there because of the blue, the light blue, but it's really a value contrast that makes it pop. The dark trees and the dark bank and the dark sand makes that water really bounce. It makes the blue look bluer. So a little more detail up here on this tree as we darken that up now. And this is the fun part. This is when we see things really start to take shape, and we get to evaluate where we're at, darken up certain areas, preserve others. In terms of light, use a little clear water here and soften some of these edges. You can see that when I go back to my palette, I don't go as much into the paint wells as I do back into the mixing wells. So I've got all the variety of colors laid out in my mixing wells. Now all I have to do is grab a little of this and a little of that, and so that I have a lot of variety. It's like that right side of that big tree there is right here is quite dark, but we don't have the detail that we need until the very end. So I'll continue to work on this. Okay, as I continue to work on this now, up here in the background, it's I'm kind of getting into some of the detail work up in here, maybe a little bit sooner than I should, but mainly I'm just trying to get the value in place back here and establish my distance, middle ground, and foreground, and do it through values. That's the biggest key, is that we control these values. I don't really have to be putting in quite as many careful little shapes as I am right here, but it's kind of my nature to do so. But as I work on this now, I'm just continually looking from side to side and from foreground to distance and saying, where do I need the darks? Well, it's pretty obvious right now that where I need to work is up in the foreground, and get some of the rest of these values and shapes in up here. So why don't I just start right here at the front and kind of finish off this foreground bush that's up here. I'll get some of the values here that darken as it turns, and down here at the bottom, anchor it with some really dark darks, and then try to be kind of cautious about the little shapes that I put into it. And those harder edges are what makes it appear to be way in the front, and of course the lighter value as well. But it feels like I need to maybe darken up just a little bit more yet, but I want to move over to this other side, right in here, and get some color. And again, look at the warms that I'm using this far up into the foreground. I want to get that feeling that the warms are up front and the cools are in the distance. And so as I work on this, I'm just kind of taking care of some of the the brighter brights and the distance, so that there isn't a whole lot of value contrast back there. And preserve that for up front. So let's see. Let's look around at a couple of these areas here and see what I need to do. compared to the dark that's in the back of the river, this part up front needs to be darker, and I may as well kind of start there. I'm mixing a little ultramarine blue here and just a touch of the quinacridone coral to make kind of a little bit of a violet color in here as I'm working on these darks up front and trying to shape the turn of that river. And seeing where to go up here. I need the darks. I'm trying to choose where I want to put some of these little, little bumps and little crevices in that sandbank as we come forward. So the work that I'm doing up here now is just kind of finishing off a little bit of the foreground. I'm bringing some darks up and along the front of that sandbank. I'm being kind of hesitant about it because I just kind of want to be sure at this point that I get it right. And so I've still got some darks to bring in up here, so we'll just whale into it and put some shapes down here in the foreground, give the indication that, this river is moving forward and it's crossing over, the wet part of it's crossing over into the sandbank a little up front. So we're trying to give that indication now. And it's a little bit confusing from the photograph and from what's there, because when we get up into the wet part, as it crosses the sand, it's kind of moist up in there, so we have a little bit of a dark in there, as you can see. But we can finish that off by just putting a few little reflections here and there, fixing up the water as it comes forward. I think that's really what it needs now, is just a few little more darks up front and complete the reflections, which I'll get to in a minute. And we're about there. Yeah, look at this. Look at that painting up above, and just kind of a visual comparison of the lights and the darks, and the part in the back as it moves forward. I'm fairly comfortable with how this is coming. Just need to kind of wrap it up. I like to squint my eyes and look at both the photograph and the painting together and see how it is. See how close I am. So once again, just picking up, I'll just tighten this little edge up here along the bank of the river, and finish up by mixing some darks and pulling them down into the water a little bit. Indication of the ripples along in the front here, as well as the shadow that comes across, but feeling like it needs to be a little bit darker and needs to have more of an indication of the reflections. And I always save this to the end pretty much as I bring it to a conclusion. Well, I think things are looking pretty good here. This painting is about done. Usually I slap a little matte on here and see what it looks like, but let's take a closer look now. This is the finished piece, and it'll go from here off to the photographer, then to the framer, then off to a show.
Well, thanks for joining me for this painting today. I'm Roland Lee. Come back again. Thank you.